Why freedom of speech will never exist. Kierkegaard explains, what if I told you that freedom of speech, the very thing we're told, is the foundation of democracy, the lifeblood of liberty, the sacred tool of truth might not actually exist, not in the way we think, not in the way we've been taught to believe, not in the way people chant about it on the streets or debate it online. In this video, I'm going to take you on a journey that will radically shift how you see freedom of speech, not as a political right, but as a deeply existential illusion. And we're going to do it through the lens of one of the most misunderstood philosophers of all time, Søren Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard wasn't interested in the surface-level debates we usually get stuck in. He wasn't asking, should the government allow people to say whatever they want? He was asking something far more profound. Can people even tell the truth at all? Can we speak freely, not just legally, but existentially? And here's where things get wild. Because Kierkegaard believed that the biggest barrier to free speech isn't censorship. It's the self. It's fear. It's the terrifying responsibility of truth. And that's why, in a sense, freedom of speech will never truly exist, not because others won't let us speak, but because we ourselves are terrified of what it would mean to speak truthfully. Let's break this down. Imagine you're standing on a mountaintop, completely alone, with no one to judge you, no laws to constrain you, no consequences to fear. Could you speak your truth then? Could you say the thing you buried deep inside for years? Could you reveal the parts of yourself that you keep hidden even from your closest friends? Kierkegaard says, probably not. Because the real censorship runs deeper than politics, it lives in our souls. And most of us are not ready to face it. You see, Kierkegaard believed that truth is not just information, but it's not just facts, it's not even just honesty. Truth is subjectivity. It's your lived experience. It's what you know in your bones but can't quite explain. And that kind of truth is dangerous. Why? Because it demands that you become it. You can't simply say it and walk away. You have to live it. You have to embody it. And that's where most people fall apart. Because living your truth, truly living it, means risking everything. It means being misunderstood, rejected, even hated. It means losing your place in the herd. And most people would rather die than be exiled from their tribe.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
That's why Kierkegaard said, people demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. Read that again. What he's getting at is brutal. We fight for the idea of free speech, but we rarely use it for anything real. We use it to echo opinions that are already socially accepted, but we use it to shout louder than others, not to go deeper within ourselves. We use it to sound smart, not to be honest. And that's not freedom. That's performance. Now pause and ask yourself, when was the last time you said something that truly cost you something? When was the last time you spoke not because it was safe or strategic, but because it was true? Have you ever censored yourself not because someone told you to, but because you didn't want to face the consequences of being known? This is the Kierkegaardian crisis. It's not about what the world allows you to say. It's about what your own fear allows you to say. And fear is the real tyrant. But Kierkegaard saw this especially in what he called the crowd. The crowd, he said, is untruth. Why? Because the crowd allows us to hide. It gives us permission to blend in, to echo, to conform. And in the crowd, we lose the burden of individuality. We become part of a chorus and forget we ever had a solo. And here's the secret: people love the crowd, even the ones who claim to be rebels, because the crowd gives you safety without responsibility. You get to feel bold without paying the price of authenticity. But truth is always lonely. It is always spoken from the mountaintop of the self, and it often echoes into silence. This is why true speech, free, honest, courageous speech is so rare, because it requires the death of the ego. It demands the collapse of your public self. And that's terrifying. That's why most people choose half-truths, safe truths, marketable truths, but never the kind of truth that sets you free, because that kind of truth first breaks you. So here's the question: do you really want to speak freely? Or do you just want to be heard? Because those are not the same thing. Do you want to express something real, or do you want to be validated? Do you want to speak truth, or do you want to avoid the pain that truth often brings? In the next part, we're going to explore the layers of self-deception that keep us from ever accessing real freedom of speech, even in a society that legally permits it. Because if you don't first free yourself from yourself, then no legal right can ever make your voice real. The Mask Within: How Self-Deception Destroys True Expression. Let's take things deeper. So far, we've scratched at the surface of why freedom of speech isn't just a political issue, it's an existential one. But now we have to confront something even more uncomfortable. The self is not merely censored by society, it is censored by itself. And this is where Kierkegaard's insights cut sharper than most modern thinkers ever dare to go. Because while we often point fingers outward to governments, to institutions, to social media algorithms, the real prison is internal. It's built from fear, maintained by lies, and disguised as identity. Kierkegaard called this despair. And despair is not sadness. Despair is the sickness of the self that refuses to be itself. Think about that for a moment. What if the reason you don't say what you really think isn't because you're scared of others, but because you don't even know what you really think? What if the biggest threat to free speech isn't censorship, but confusion? Kierkegaard says that most people live in what he called the aesthetic stage, a life of distraction, of appearances, of endless entertainment. In this stage, people avoid the real questions. They avoid the self. They build a life of masks. And once you wear a mask long enough, it stops being a disguise and starts becoming your face. Here's where things get tragic. When you deceive yourself, when you refuse to face your true beliefs, your real fears, your deepest contradictions, you lose the ability to speak truthfully. Not because you're lying, but because you've forgotten what's real. And that's the most dangerous form of censorship, the kind you believe is authenticity. But when your public persona becomes so convincing even to yourself, your voice becomes hollow. Every sentence you speak carries the echo of someone else's approval. But every opinion is filtered through the fear of being outcast. You don't express yourself, you curate yourself. Let me ask you this: when you speak, who are you speaking for? Your soul or your image? Do your words emerge from the raw chaos of your lived experience, or from the polished rhetoric of what you think will be accepted, applauded, or at least tolerated? Kierkegaard would say that the vast majority of us are not speaking, we're parroting. We're performing. We're saying what we've been conditioned to say, what we've learned is safe, what won't disrupt the fragile equilibrium of our social world. But that's not freedom. That's not even living. Now, Kierkegaard believed that the only way out of this trap is through a brutal confrontation with the self. A moment of crisis, a collapse. He called it the leap, a leap into the existential abyss of who you really are, not who you pretend to be, not who your parents raised you to be, not who your followers think you are, but the unfiltered, unmarketable, unresolved truth of your being. And here's the terrifying part: you won't like what you find. At least not at first. Because real self-knowledge is not flattering. But it doesn't stroke the ego, it shatters it. But in that shattering, something miraculous happens. When the false self dies, a space opens up. A silence that's no longer empty but sacred. And from that silence, real speech begins. Not clever speech, not strategic speech, but speech that costs you something. Speech that reveals, not conceals. Speech that doesn't seek applause, but invites transformation. Kierkegaard called this the religious stage of life, not because it's about organized religion, but because it's about radical inwardness. A life where your speech is not a broadcast, but a revelation. And this brings us to a paradox. True freedom of speech only begins when you stop trying to be free in the eyes of others. Because as long as your speech is tethered to how it will be received, you're not free, you're a hostage. Your words are not your own, they belong to the crowd. And the crowd, as Kierkegaard warned, is always the enemy of truth. So what's the takeaway here? It's this: freedom of speech isn't something that can be granted by the state. It's not something that can be defended in court or protected by laws. But those things matter, yes, but they're not enough. Because even in the free society, you can still be a slave to your own mask. You can still live in fear of your own voice. You can still spend your life speaking and yet never say anything true. And so the question we must ask ourselves is not just, am I allowed to speak? But am I speaking from what is real? Am I willing to risk being misunderstood, misjudged, even rejected if it means I can say something that actually matters? Am I willing to lose the world's approval to gain my own soul? In the next part, D is say, Pi. We'll explore how this existential fear of truth has created a culture where even the loudest voices are often the most silent, and why Kierkegaard believed that silence, not speech, might be the most honest form of communication in a world addicted to noise. The silence that screams, why loud societies still don't hear the truth. We are living in the noisiest age in human history. But never before have so many people had the tools, the platforms, and the perceived permission to speak. Social media has turned every smartphone into a stage, every user into a broadcaster. We are surrounded by words, tweets, comments, videos, hot takes, think pieces, podcasts, live streams. The volume is deafening. And yet, Kierkegaard would say, we've never been more silent. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? How can a world that's constantly talking be silent? But that's the kind of paradox Kierkegaard specialized in. Because what he understood, what most modern minds miss, is that noise is not the same as speech, and speech is not the same as truth. Sometimes, the louder a society becomes, the less it actually hears. Because when everyone is speaking at once, no one is truly listening. And even more dangerously, no one is truly saying anything. We have replaced substance with spectacle. We have traded reflection for reaction. And in doing so, we have created a world where freedom of speech is a right we all have, but truth is a reality almost no one practices. Ask yourself, How many of the words you hear every day are actually real? Not factual, but real. Words that come from someone's depths, not their desire to impress or provoke or go viral. Words that carry the weight of lived pain, unfiltered insight, and existential risk. Words that reveal rather than disguise. Very few. Because in a culture of noise, the incentive is not to be true, it's to be loud. It's to be fast. It's to be seen. And when the goal is visibility, truth becomes optional, even dangerous. Kierkegaard would say that this is the tragedy of modernity. We have confused communication with communion. But we think that because we are constantly expressing ourselves, we are being authentic. But in reality, most of our expression is a mask, a performance designed to shield us from the very vulnerability that real communication requires. And this is why, despite all our speech, we feel so unseen. Because no one is speaking from their center, and no one is listening from theirs. We are yelling past each other, not speaking to each other. We are broadcasting, not bearing witness. And so, ironically, the people who are often closest to truth are not the ones speaking, but the ones who have fallen silent. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they are waiting for something worth saying. Kierkegaard believed that silence is not the absence of speech, it is the presence of depth. It is the space where words are born, not just repeated. And in a world addicted to noise, silence becomes revolutionary. But here's the deeper twist. True silence is terrifying. Because when we stop speaking, we are forced to confront the space between our thoughts, the void, the uncertainty, the questions we've been avoiding. And most people can't handle that. Most people fill the silence with distractions not because they're shallow, but because they're scared. Scared of what they'll find in the stillness. Scared that, deep down, they don't know who they are without the noise. But Kierkegaard insists it's only in that silence that the real self begins to emerge. And from that self, real speech can finally arise. So here's the question you need to wrestle with. Are you speaking because you have something to say, or because you're afraid of what might surface if you don't? Are your words a gift or a shield? Are you adding to the noise or breaking it with truth? In the next and final part, we'll explore Kierkegaard's most daring idea that to speak freely, you must first die not physically, but existentially. You must allow the false self to collapse so that the true voice can rise. Because only when the self is reborn in truth can freedom of speech become something more than a right, it becomes a sacred act. The death of the self. Why you must die to speak freely. Here we arrive at the final and most unsettling truth, one that Kierkegaard would whisper rather than shout. Because it's not something easily accepted, even less easily lived. If you truly want to speak freely, not just legally, not just socially, but existentially, you must first die. Not a literal death, but something far more difficult, the death of the false self. The ego, the persona. The identity you've spent your whole life building to survive in a world that rewards conformity and punishes authenticity. Kierkegaard knew that no one can speak the truth until they have passed through this inward crucifixion. Because only when the self that fears rejection, applause, and misunderstanding has been stripped away can your voice finally become real. Most people don't realize it, but the thing stopping them from speaking their truth isn't censorship, algorithms, or governments. It's the fear of who they'll become if they do. Because truth changes you. It burns away illusions. It sets fire to the comfortable lies you've told yourself, and it demands that you live in alignment with what you know in your bones to be real. And that's not easy. That's not marketable. That's not safe. To speak freely, you must no longer care about being liked. But you must no longer be attached to your place in the crowd. You must be willing to be misunderstood, to walk alone, to be seen as strange, even foolish. And in a world obsessed with image, that is a kind of death. But Kierkegaard didn't see this death as a loss. He saw it as a necessary transformation. Because only in dying to the false self can you be reborn into the real one. And only the real self can speak words that matter, words that don't just inform, but transform, words that don't bend to culture, but bend reality itself by revealing what's been hidden. Kierkegaard believed that truth is not found, it's suffered. It's lived. And it's only through that suffering that inner freedom is born. Ask yourself, what part of you is still afraid to be seen? What truth are you still hiding because you fear it will cost you something, your reputation, your relationships, your rhythm of life? Are you living in such a way that your speech is always safe, always strategic, always filtered through the lens of acceptance? If so, you may be legally free to speak, but you are not existentially speaking freely. Because true speech is not rehearsed, it's wrestled. It doesn't come from comfort, it comes from the grave of who you used to be. Kierkegaard was clear: the individual must stand alone before God, before truth, before eternity. Not as a member of a group, not as a brand, not as a role, but as a naked self. The more we cling to our roles, student, parent, influencer, intellectual, the more our speech becomes scripted. But when we allow those roles to fall away, when we dare to ask the terrifying question, who am I without them? We begin to see the outline of something deeper, something eternal. And from that place we begin to speak not just as individuals, but as souls. And that, ultimately, is what freedom of speech must mean, if it is to mean anything at all, not just the ability to say what you want, but the courage to say what is true. Not just to speak, but to reveal. Not just to be heard, but to be known. So here is the final question. Are you willing to die to everything false in you so that the truth can speak through you? Are you willing to lose the world's approval to gain your own soul? Are you finally ready to be free? And if not, then freedom of speech will remain a myth, not because someone took it from you, but because you never dared to claim it in the first place. Now ask yourself, in the silence that follows, what truth have you been too afraid to speak? And what would happen if you finally did?